He never attended seminary. He had no theology degree, no denominational backing, no powerful mentor to open doors for him. He was the son of a Pennsylvania farmer, one of 6 children, raised in poverty, forced to leave school early to help support his family. By every institutional measure of his day, A.W. Tozer had no business becoming one of the most influential voices in 20th century Christianity. And yet, at 17 years old, he heard a street preacher in Akron, Ohio say something that stopped him cold. "If you don't know how to be saved, just call on God." He walked home, climbed to the attic, and did exactly that. No altar call, no counselor, no program. Just a young man and a God he had not yet met, and a meeting that changed everything. That moment did not launch him into immediate ministry. It launched him into years of quiet, determined, self-directed formation. Tozer could not afford books, so he haunted libraries. He could not afford a theological education, so he built one himself, reading the church fathers, the medieval mystics, the Puritans, the great devotional writers of every century. He read not to accumulate information, but to be transformed by it. There is a difference. Most people who read theology come away with more knowledge. Tozer came away with more God. When he began preaching, he had no platform and no connections. He pastored small, struggling churches. He drove worn-out cars. He lived simply, almost austerely by choice. While other ministers were building networks and chasing opportunities, Tozer was doing something that looked, from the outside, like almost nothing he was becoming. This distinction matters more than almost anything else this video will say. There is a version of ministry, a version of any calling, that is primarily about building an external presence. And there is a version that is primarily about internal formation. They can look similar from a distance. They produce entirely different results over time. Tozer chose formation, and the fruit of that choice would eventually reach millions of people he never met, in languages he never spoke, in generations he would not live to see. By the time Tozer took the pulpit at Southside Alliance Church in Chicago in 1928, he had already spent years developing something rare, a voice that was entirely his own, not borrowed from the popular preachers of the day, not shaped by what audiences wanted to hear. A voice forged in solitude, in scripture, in the kind of sustained prayer that most ministers talk about more than they practice. Chicago knew it immediately. The congregation grew, not because Tozer was charming, not because he was warm in the conventional pastoral sense, but because he told the truth. He had a gift for naming what people were experiencing in their interior lives, but had no language for. He could describe the hunger of a soul searching for God with a precision that made listeners feel simultaneously exposed and understood. But recognition came with resistance. The wider evangelical world of his era was moving in a direction Tozer found deeply troubling. The mid-20th century saw the rise of celebrity Christianity, large crusades, radio ministries, the beginning of what would eventually become the full machinery of Christian media and entertainment. Tozer watched it with a prophet's unease. He saw the crowd being mistaken for the Spirit. He saw growth being mistaken for depth. He saw the church becoming increasingly comfortable with a version of Christianity that demanded very little and therefore produced very little. He said so, loudly, in print and from the pulpit. He called it the great evangelical disaster, long before others were willing to name it. He wrote in his editorials for the Alliance Weekly, which he edited for years and transformed into one of the sharpest theological voices in American evangelicalism, that the church had lost its capacity for awe, that the concept of God held by most Christians had shrunk to something manageable, predictable, and ultimately powerless. That worship had become entertainment, and sermons had become self-help dressed in religious language. His peers did not always thank him for this. Invitations were not plentiful. His name did not appear on the conference circuit the way lesser men's names did. He was respected by many who privately found him too uncomfortable to platform publicly. He did not seem to mind. A man who has spent enough time alone with God develops a particular kind of freedom, the freedom of someone who no longer needs the approval of the room to know where he stands. There is a life that no one sees. No camera captures it. No crowd applauds it. No metrics measure it. It happens in the early hours before the world wakes up, in the quiet corners of ordinary rooms, in the long silences between a soul and its God. Tozer called it the interior life, and he believed it was the only life that ultimately mattered. While his contemporaries were building platforms, Tozer was building something else entirely. He was known to spend hours in prayer before ever opening a book or preparing a message. Not minutes, hours, prostrate on the floor of his study, silent, waiting, not asking God to bless his plans, but surrendering the plans entirely. The people who knew him closely described a man who seemed to carry a permanent awareness of God's presence, not as a theological concept, but as a lived, moment-by-moment reality. This was not accidental. It was the result of years of deliberate, costly, unglamorous interior work. Tozer drew deeply from the Christian mystics, men and women like Thomas à Kempis, Meister Eckhart, and Madame Guyon, who had mapped the terrain of the interior life centuries before him. He understood that the great danger of Christian ministry was not immorality or heresy. It was shallowness, the danger of a man who speaks much about God but knows little of Him, who prays publicly with great eloquence and privately, almost not at all. He made a distinction that is worth pausing on. He said there is an enormous difference between working for God and knowing God. A man can build a ministry, fill a church, write books, preach thousands of sermons, and do all of it while remaining, at the deepest level, a stranger to the God he represents. The activity can be real. The relationship can be almost non-existent. The hidden life is the correction to that danger. It is the place where the gap between what you say and what you are gets closed, slowly, painfully, and without any audience to validate the process. Tozer never promoted his prayer life. He never turned his interior discipline into a platform. The hours he spent alone with God were not content. They were the source of everything that eventually became content. That is a distinction the modern church has almost entirely lost. In the winter of 1948, A.W. Tozer boarded a train in Chicago bound for Texas. He had no ghostwriter, no research assistant, no carefully curated outline produced by a publishing team. He had a pen, a notepad, and decades of interior life pressing to get out. By the time the train arrived, the manuscript was done. The Pursuit of God was not written as a commercial project. It was not designed to sell. Tozer did not write it thinking about an audience or a market or a message that would resonate with the largest number of people. He wrote it because something in him could not stay silent any longer, because years of seeking God in obscurity had produced a pressure that needed release, and the only honest release was the page. The book was published quietly. No major publisher with a powerful distribution network, no celebrity endorsements from the famous preachers of the day, no launch event, no campaign. It entered the world the same way its author had lived, without fanfare, without noise, without the machinery of celebration behind it. And then something happened that no marketing strategy could have engineered. People read it and were undone, not entertained, not inspired in the shallow sense of the word, undone. Readers described the experience of opening that book and feeling, for the first time in years, that someone understood the deepest hunger of their soul and knew the way to feed it. The book spread the way fire spreads when the conditions are right, not because someone promoted it, but because it was alive. 75 years later, it has never gone out of print. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It sits on the shelves of believers across every denomination, every continent, every generation. A book written by a man the religious establishment of his day largely ignored, outlasted everything the religious establishment of his day built. This is the pattern Tozer embodied, and that this video exists to name clearly. What is born in obscurity and rooted in God does not expire. What is born in the spotlight and rooted in the crowd rarely survives the next season. If Tozer's life was a warning, it was also a promise, because the same pattern that exposed what God cannot use also reveals with equal clarity what God actually uses. Look at the men and women Scripture consistently chose to work through. David was the youngest son, dismissed so completely by his own father that he wasn't even called in from the fields when the prophet came to anoint a king. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness, not as punishment, but as preparation. 40 years of obscurity before a single word of his public ministry was spoken. Paul, after his conversion, disappeared into Arabia for years before emerging as the voice that would shape Christian theology for 2 millennia. The pattern is not coincidental, it is intentional. God does not use the most celebrated, he uses the most prepared. And preparation, real preparation, the kind that produces something lasting, almost always happens in hiddenness. In the years nobody is watching. In the seasons that feel like delay, but are actually formation. Andrew Murray spent years in a small South African parish before his writings reached the world. John of the Cross wrote his most profound works while imprisoned in a cell. Amy Carmichael served in India for 55 years without a single furlough, unknown to most of the Western Church during her lifetime, yet leaving a legacy that still rescues children today. Tozer fits perfectly in this lineage, not as an exception, as a confirmation. What God uses is not talent disconnected from character, not charisma without consecration, not growth without roots. What God uses is a person who has been alone with him long enough to stop performing and start being. A person whose private life and public life have become the same life. A person for whom the presence of God is not a stage experience, but a permanent address. Tozer said it with characteristic directness. The man who has God for his treasure has all things in one. Not the man who has a platform, not the man who has an audience. The man who has God. And here is the most confronting part of all this. Availability matters more than ability. God is not searching the earth for the most gifted communicator or the most strategic leader. He is looking for the person who has emptied themselves enough to be filled, who has become quiet enough to hear, who has stayed faithful long enough to be trusted. That person may never fill a stadium, they may never trend online, the world may never celebrate them, but they will be used deeply, permanently, and in ways that outlast every applause that was ever given to someone else. The question is never whether God can use you. The question is whether you are willing to pay the price of becoming the kind of person he uses. There is a cost to choosing depth over fame. Tozer paid it, and he paid it consciously, not accidentally. He was not naive about what he was giving up. He watched contemporaries build larger churches, receive more invitations, generate more applause, accumulate more influence by the world's measurement. He understood the trade-off clearly, and he chose, repeatedly, with full awareness of what the choice meant, to go deeper rather than wider, to become more rather than to appear more. The cost showed up in his personal life in ways that are uncomfortable to examine. His marriage was strained. His children grew up feeling secondary to his calling. His wife, Ada, said after his death that she had been happier in the years following his passing, a statement so stark it is almost impossible to process. It does not diminish the man's spiritual legacy, but it complicates the portrait. It adds the weight of real humanity to what could otherwise become a sanitized, heroic narrative. Depth costs something, always, and the honest version of Tozer's story refuses to hide that. But there is another side to this cost, a side that is rarely discussed because it requires a long view most people are unwilling to take. The cost of choosing depth is real. The cost of choosing shallowness is worse. The man who builds wide without building deep eventually collapses under the weight of what he has constructed. The ministry that grows faster than the minister's character becomes a burden he cannot carry. The audience that outpaces the interior life becomes a prison because the performance must continue, the image must be maintained, and the gap between what is projected and what is real becomes a source of private torment that no amount of applause can silence. Tozer chose a different kind of suffering. The suffering of obscurity, of limitation, of being misunderstood by his peers. But it was a suffering that produced something. The other suffering, the suffering of the man who sacrificed depth for visibility, tends to produce only exhaustion, emptiness, and eventually collapse. The question this moment asks is not whether you will suffer. You will. The question is which suffering you will choose, the suffering that forms you or the suffering that eventually destroys you. Tozer wrote near the end of his life that he had found God to be cordial and generous and in every way easy to live with. That sentence was not written by a man who had found life easy. It was written by a man who had found, through every hard season and every costly choice, that the presence of God was worth more than everything he had ever been offered in exchange for it. That is the testimony of a man who chose depth. Not a perfect man, not a painless life, but a life that meant something to God, to the church, and to every soul that has ever picked up his books and felt, for the first time, that the hunger inside them had a name. A.W. Tozer died on May 12, 1963. He was 66 years old. He had pastored his final church in Toronto for less than 2 years. He died quietly, without ceremony, without a deathbed surrounded by thousands of lives he knew he had changed. He died the way he had lived, without fanfare. He had preached just days before his death. Those who heard him said there was nothing in his voice that sounded like a man finishing. He sounded like a man still running, still hungry, still reaching for something ahead of him, rather than looking back at what he had left behind. That posture, forward, hungry, unfinished, is itself a message. Tozer never wrote a memoir. He never published an autobiography or a final definitive statement of his life's meaning. He left behind sermons and books and editorials, but no grand summary, no attempt to package his legacy into something tidy and presentable. Because men who actually know God rarely feel the need to do that. The life itself was the statement. In the decades since his death, his influence has not declined. It has grown. Each generation discovers him slightly differently, some through the pursuit of God, some through the knowledge of the holy, some through a quote pulled from a sermon and shared on a screen. But the discovery always feels the same, like finding someone who was telling the truth in a world full of performance. That is his enduring legacy, not a denomination, not an institution, not a building with his name on it. The legacy of A.W. Tozer is the persistent, uncomfortable, beautiful invitation to stop settling for religion and start pursuing God himself. He finished his race, and the finish line turned out to be not an ending, but a door. You are living in the most distracted moment in human history. Every platform is engineered to pull your attention outward, toward metrics, toward comparison, toward the performance of a life rather than the living of one. The noise is not neutral, it is forming you. And if you are not intentional about what you are becoming on the inside, the outside will answer that question for you. Tozer's life is not just history, it is a mirror. It asks you directly, what are you actually pursuing? Not what you say you are pursuing. What the evidence of your hours, your habits, your private moments actually reveals you are pursuing. Because what you pursue in secret is what you become in public. Always, without exception. The hunger for God that Tozer describes in his writing is not a poetic metaphor. It is a diagnosis and an invitation. The diagnosis is that most of us are feeding on things that were never designed to satisfy the deepest part of us. The platforms, the validation, the numbers, the applause, they are not evil, but they are not food. And a soul that has been trying to live on them knows at a level beneath words that something essential is still starving. The invitation is to turn, not to a religion, not to a set of disciplines designed to make you feel spiritual, but to God Himself as the actual, living, present reality that Tozer spent his entire life insisting he is. The pursuit of God begins with a prayer, and the prayer begins like this: I have tasted thy goodness, and it has both satisfied me and made me thirsty for more. That is the paradox of the interior life. The more you find, the more you want. Not because God is insufficient, but because He is inexhaustible. Every depth you reach reveals another depth below it. Every encounter leaves you more alive than the one before. Tozer ran that race for 40 years of public ministry and decades of hidden preparation before that. He never stopped running. He never arrived at a place where he felt he had learned enough, found enough, gone deep enough. That is the life available to you, not the life of the platform, the life of the pursuit. The question is not whether you are hungry. You are. The question is what you are willing to do about it.